Well, good day there and welcome to Faith, Culture, Politics in Australia. I'm Mark, and before we bring on today's guest, just a reminder to everybody that if what you see and you'd like to follow along, hit that like and subscribe button, and of course share widely as well. So before I introduce our guest for today, I'm just going to play a real quick video to introduce what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll just play that for you right now, and we'll go from
To an
there.
overview of direct democracy and how direct democracy can work for Australia. Do you agree that Aussies should have more say on important decisions? We are told Australia is built on democratic principles. Every few years we elect representatives to make decisions on our behalf based on promises made. But as you know by now, despite what we were told during election campaigns, many major decisions that drastically affect people's lives are made without the public being asked. And such decisions often have a major, lasting impact on our lives. Worryingly, once in place, they often become near impossible to change. Direct democracy adds a vital missing layer. It gives us, the Australian people, a direct say on critical national decisions. Here is what it does not mean. It does not replace Parliament. It does not mean voting on everything. However, it means participation on key issues. It means being asked, respected, and listened to. Because even when people disagree on outcomes, the reality is being asked builds trust. Direct democracy is not about ideology or allegiance to one particular party. It is about fairness, a voice for all members of this great nation. It's about participation and having confidence in decision-making. Participation, fairness, trust, direct democracy in Australia. The time has arrived. We welcome your support.
So there you go. That was a little bit of an intro video just explaining about the topic that we're going to be talking about today, direct democracy. And I'm just going to introduce who I am going to be speaking with today as well. So today I'm catching up with Tom Blackford. So Tom is someone whose journey in many ways mirrors my own. He's worked in mental health as a social worker since 1987 and continues today as a private counsellor after his public role came to an end during the COVID vaccine mandates in late 2021. For most of his life, he wasn't particularly interested in politics, but the lockdowns and mandates in Australia became a turning point, prompting him to look more closely at government decisions, media narratives, and how much influence ordinary citizens really have over the policies that shape their lives. With more time to research and connect with others, he became especially interested in the idea of citizen-initiated referenda, a form of direct democracy inspired by the Swiss model. That growing interest in citizen participation and democratic reform is what ultimately led him to get involved with and support Direct Democracy Australia, helping raise awareness about giving people a more direct voice in state and national decision making. So I'm going to bring in Tom now. G'day there, Tom Blackford. Welcome to Faith, Culture, Politics in Australia. Good to have you on board.
All right, thanks, Mark. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about this subject, which is very interesting to me, and I think a lot of people would like to learn about it.
Yeah, very, very topical. And just before, I guess we do sort of jump into the nitty-gritty of it, you're, I guess a similar vintage to myself, maybe a little bit older, and we're sort of getting on there. What's driving you to sort of make a difference to look at, the democratic process, the elections and citizen-initiated referendum? What's your main driver?
Yeah, so in that blurb that you read out, it mentions how I left that job before I was intending to. The government brought in some rules which, compelled me to make a decision, and I didn't want to go along with the choice they were offering. And so as a result of that, I just sort of came across people who were politically minded, much more than me, and they were saying things which caused me to research and learn about. And, it just felt as though there are a lot of things going on in this country that were not really to my liking, and perhaps to the liking of a lot of people. And I hadn't taken much interest in politics, but it came to pass that there were many decisions made which were very costly, very expensive to the population. We've got abundant resources in this beautiful land that we live in, and yet those riches don't seem to flow to the people so much. Some people get very, very wealthy, and a lot of people struggle, and that's been even more so since the COVID times, more apparent to me anyway.
Yeah, exactly right. And I often say, I mean, I share a very similar journey to you. I was in the disability sector, and I was terminated in 2021 for making a choice not to receive the injections at the time, and so it cost me quite a bit. And there's a lot of strain, obviously, on family, and you could see that all around our communities how much people were suffering. But one of the reasons I, continue to do what I'm doing now, I am gainfully employed again now in a different sector altogether, which suits my needs. But one of the reasons that I continue to do what I'm doing now, once I've sort of become more politically involved, is because I'm hoping to help create a better future than what I see currently for my kids and grandkids. I'm a father and a grandfather, and that's one of the reasons that kind of keeps motivating me. As I said, I'm in my 50s. You're a little bit older, and so we're kind of getting into that, and sort of towards the end of, I guess, our lifespan. And for me, it's really about making a difference, a positive difference for the future of the kids and grandkids and others. And I just don't, the trajectory that we're on at the moment, I don't think is really beneficial for their future. Is that kind of a little bit like that for yourself as well?
Yeah. And so I'm 70. My children are 40 and 37. And they've supplied me with grandchildren, which is lovely. Because my children are the age they are, they're sort of in the housing market, and so they've got a foothold in that, and so they're got good jobs and better off than a lot of their peers. But my grandchildren, I can't see that they're ever going to get into the housing market the way things are going, and there are increasing controls in our society. And a lot of those decisions get made without much consultation with people. So I'm concerned about the direction that things are going in.
Yeah, and you and I are both, we're both based in South Australia, and we've sort of we got to know each other over the last sort of 12 months or so. It's very similar. I'm involved with an organisation called Australians for Better Government. You're obviously involved in Direct Democracy Australia, so very similar sort of things. And I know that there's lots of others kicking off now. We've got, the Australian Lobby Group, who, so all these people, all these groups that have formed over the last 4 or 5 years because people have seen something fundamentally wrong with the way that we're governed. And I think COVID really hit that home in a lot of ways, where government and bureaucracies could make legislation or laws that really did impact the freedoms and liberties of Australians. Now, no one disputes that if there's a pandemic, there needs to be action, there needs to be responses to, for the, welfare of everybody. But a lot of people now in hindsight realise that there are a lot of the controls that are in place that the government and bureaucracy have awarded themselves over years actually was it to the detriment of individual freedoms and liberties. Is that kind of what's the sense of it that you have in regards to it as well?
Yeah, very much. Because our topic today is about direct democracy, I recently, in fact, less than a week ago, I gave a presentation to a group of social work colleagues, and I thought I might use a number of the things I talked about in that to introduce direct democracy. In fact, direct democracy is sort of a solution, or potential solution, that people might agree is useful, and as a lead into that, I think it'd be useful to sort of create some context. And I might ask you some questions, because I had a group of people I was asking questions last Thursday, but you're my only one here. So
Sure.
my first question was about, what degree of economic prosperity do you imagine for your children and your grandchildren going forward?
So if we're talking about economic prosperity, I guess it's really just about being able to, live above the breadline. I guess just being able to, live. I guess, own a home, pay a mortgage efficiently, and have enough money left over where you can kind of enjoy a holiday and not have to scrimp and scrape. I think, I'm a pretty sort of simple guy. I don't want to, $1 million and all these yachts and all that. But everybody has different, I guess, wants and needs. But for me, it's really just being able to afford the everyday stuff without having to cut back on other stuff. I guess, that's kind of where I see it.
Do you know what the average size of mortgages are in Australia at the minute?
Oh, look, I think it's up around the $650,000, around that sort of ballpark figure.
Yeah, that's the figure I researched the other day. And so what do you think the chances are of your children and your grandchildren owning a home in the future and having that security?
Look, it's really, really tough when you consider that sort of mortgage just to get into the entry. Just the deposit to be able to get that is a real stretch for people to be able to save the deposit. But that's just the cost of the house, because we know that government charges stamp duty as well on top of all of that. So there's a massive hit on young families trying to even get into the home market. So yeah, I'm quite aware of that.
And so, a lot of young adults now in their 20s, early 30s, it's probably too late for most of those. How are they going to save up, 600,000 plus? And so what are the consequences for that? It means that some of those adults will be living with their parents. If they're dating and find a partner that they want to live with, they might not be able to move out of home. They might be living with their parents and having children in that home. In fact, I've heard of some families who are building add-ons so that their children can stay living in their block of land because it's too expensive for them to move out. And that might also deter people from finding a partner. If the house is too crowded already, how are they going to bring that person home to live there, or to have children and raise the children there? It's not an option for many, many people. And so increasingly we hear about the declining birth rate in Western countries. Just today I heard that the birth rate in South Korea is 0.8, whereas 2.1 children per woman is required just to keep the population steady. And so the number of Western countries which are facing a big challenge. Another question I asked the group last week: how many billionaires are there in Australia?
Well, that's a good question. Just if I was to guess, billionaires, I'd maybe say 500 to 1,000, maybe.
Okay, Australia isn't that wealthy. So in 2015 there were 74. In 10 years later there was 161. So 2025 there were 161.
Wow.
And the reason I looked that up was I was listening to a podcast and someone was talking about America, and that since the Reagan era to the present day, $50 to $60 trillion of wealth have moved from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So there's this huge transfer of wealth going to the very, very rich. And that speaker was saying it wasn't through, free enterprise, wonderful capitalism. It was through corporations and lobbyists that there's increasingly monopolies or huge companies that have undue influence over politicians. And they can do deals that favour them, that go against the little guy. And so, when I was young, there were lots of hardware stores. Now there's just Bunnings. These huge monolithic organisations, and so people had livelihoods. They worked hard. They enjoyed that. They had sort of control over their own life to a greater degree than we have now. And now they're just employees, and they go and work for these huge corporations, and they have a lot of power with governments. They make donations to the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, and so they like keeping those donations, and they do things that favour the interests of large corporations. And gradually this money, it flows upwards. It doesn't trickle down to us, it flows up. And so this is something I've become aware of. And one of the other things I talked about last week was punters politics. Have you heard of punters politics? A YouTube channel?
Yeah, I've heard of punters politics. Yep.
Yeah. Conrad Benjamin. And so he opened my eyes in this last 2 to 3 years watching his videos. And the very first one I watched talked about an American company getting the deal to dig up the natural gas in Northern Territory. And that gas field was worth about $150 billion. And they didn't have to pay us anything. It was, in fact, there was a small inducement by that state of Australia, I won't name, for that company to come in and provide the jobs and take these resources away. And we think, oh, well, providing jobs, we get some benefit from that. But they pointed out there was the mining company in that place provided 0.7% of the jobs. And so not much gain for the resource that is going overseas. And I calculated that 150 billion divided by the population, it was about $50,000 per person. I mean, obviously that wouldn't all be profit. There'd be expenses in digging that up and so on. And then he told story after story, similar. And he keeps producing these things so that more people have heard of him now, and more politicians are being faced with this challenge. Do we keep giving these resources away for free? And so those are some of the things that sort of have alerted me, and why I want to speak out about direct democracy. There was another guy I came across, and Gary Stevenson, and he's got a channel called Gary's Economics, and he was pointing out some obvious numbers. Really, he was saying a billionaire, $1,000 million. If they had $1 billion invested at 5% in a bank account, they would be earning $1 million a week. And so those billionaires, do they need $1 million a week? They've probably already got a yacht or 2 yachts, cars, a mansion, an island perhaps. What do they need $1 million a week for when we've got people who are homeless and struggling? And so Gary, on his channel, he's talking about the fact that an idea is to tax the wealth of people, not the wages, not the earnings. And his idea is controversial. A lot of rich people don't like the sound of this, and but I guess he's just throwing out an idea for people to consider. And yeah, I talked about home ownership and the changes there, the mortgages, the growing number of billionaires, because the trajectory that we all face is something where the rich are going to get more rich and the poor are going to get more poor. And do we want things to go in that direction? And Gary, who's British born and lives in Britain, he was talking about the fact that it was only post World War II that people came to collect assets to have any sort of wealth. And you know, if you look back through maybe early TV shows or the turn of the century or books and so on, regular people didn't have assets. They lived in boarding houses. They might have worked for wealthy landowners, and they lived and worked for them. You know, people had jobs, but they went back to their boarding homes. You know, it would have been very difficult to raise a family, like to afford to get married and have children. And so things changed after World War II, perhaps through unions, you know, through collaborating and putting pressure on governments. But all of that could be lost. That's what Gary is saying. And so that's a sobering thought. He said, you know, the wealth that we might have now, this was not the case, you know, in the 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It was never the case for us. So if we want if we want to maintain something like we have now, people have to organise together and turn things around. So part of what's happening, you know, in the last 2 decades, 4 decades, 6 decades, is that you know, we've had we've had the development of a welfare state, and there are lots of benefits that come from that. You know, we've had healthcare in Australia, which is, you know, affordable and largely free. We had largely free education. Lots of good things have come. And the NDIS is another change that happened. I don't know whether it's 10 years old now, but you know, that was a change that made people's lives easier in many respects. All of those things come at a cost, of course. And if we were reaping the benefits of our mineral resources and those sectors, we could afford those things. But we're not really reaping the rewards of those things. And increasingly, we hear that governments borrow money, and Australia is close to $1 trillion in debt. And Western countries around the world are borrowing and borrowing. And when that happens, governments need to find where to get that money from to repay those debts. In Britain, I heard that 50% of their population now already receive some government benefit, whether it be the old age pension, unemployment benefits, family allowance, and so on. So, you know, when that becomes the case, the government really can't tax the bottom half of the population anymore. And so what they're left to do is either tax the very wealthy, which they don't seem to want to do, or they tax the middle class. And the middle class will shrink and shrink if the governments continue to tax them. And only in the last couple of weeks I heard of the Netherlands putting a tax on unrealised gains. And this was a video by Topher Field, and I understand from that video that it might apply to the family home. I haven't checked that detail out, but he was talking about the fact that if the person's house went up by $100,000, the tax rate is 36% on that, and so they would have to find $36,000 to pay the tax on that for that year. And of course, most people don't have a spare $36,000 in the bank account to pay that. So where are the government going to get the money to pay the next tax rise? And it's going to become increasingly difficult to find new sources of revenue from the middle class. So these are all of the things which have been, coming across I spend a lot of time looking at YouTube and finding out these things. And another thing which has become apparent to a lot of people who are watching YouTube and other channels is the move towards the people being interested in so-called far-right political groups. And in Germany, the recent elections, the AfD, I don't know what that stands for, but that was the party which was the most popular. And it arose out of nowhere to become, number one. But they didn't form government because they didn't get 50%. And the previous leading parties, which would have been at odds with each other, they joined together in some coalition so that the AfD didn't get to bring in their policies. In the EU, the Romanian election was overturned, and the leader of the winning party was not allowed to rerun at the next election. And similarly here, people are aware that Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party has grown in popularity, and with the hate speech laws, apparently she was referred to the Australian Federal Police very recently for some remark that she made. And under these new laws, there's the capacity for the government to outlaw any group. So would they do that to her group? Who knows? But these things are happening in other places in the world. And so things are not going well in many, many respects. And so that leads me to this idea of direct democracy. And so in Switzerland, it's called CIR, which stands for Citizen Initiated Referendum. And I came across this about a bit more than a year ago. There was a guy talking about this concept, and though he was referring to the Swiss model. And so in Switzerland, a country with about 9 million people, they have 3 levels of government like we do. And since 1971, they've had this system whereby if a group of people get an idea that they favour, a group of about 12 people, I think it's a minimum, that goes off to the government, who sort of make sure it's a coherent proposal. And then if this group is able to get 100,000 signatures favouring this proposal, then the government is compelled to hold a referendum on that proposal. And the result of that referendum is binding on the government. They also have this idea that if a government passes some law and enough people don't like it, in fact, they have to get 50,000 signatures against some law, that also triggers a compulsory referendum, and that's binding on the government. So the people there have a lot of influence over what the governments can do. And in fact, in Switzerland, there's been a very stable arrangement with the top 4 parties for many years now. And they know that they have to develop legislation in such a way that it's going to meet sort of the broad appeal of the parties, of the public. And so what tends to happen is that they don't bring in legislation which is like extremely right-wing or extremely left-wing, because they know that people oppose that. In fact, in Switzerland, the people there have had a very long-standing involvement by people in the parliamentary system. And in fact, 7% of the voters are members of political parties in Switzerland. Compare that to Britain, where it's about 1%. And probably in Australia, it would be about 1%.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that system has been operating very well. And when they've done surveys of the population about, what percentage of the population in Switzerland support and favour their political system, it's up like 80%. When they do those surveys in Britain, I forget whether it was 13% or 20%, but it was pretty poor. And so a system like that, I think a lot of people would be in favour of having a direct say in the laws that shape their life and shape our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to a couple of things that you were saying, there's a lot of, I think one of the things is the amount of engagement from the average Australian in the political system. Now, you and I are probably good examples of that. Before 2020, I was not very engaged in politics myself. Paying off a mortgage, raising a family, all those sorts of things. And politics to me was just one of those things. Yeah, you turn up to vote, and you look who's around and you vote. But I've definitely learned over the past 5 years that it's critical that people be involved in politics and the type of people that they end up electing into the parliament to represent us, because ultimately people are fallible. People are drawn towards money and influence, and they've had the ear, as you mentioned before, the ear of lobby groups and all these other sorts of things. So it's very easy for politicians and people that I guess aren't very principled in regards to working for the betterment of people to get influenced by others. I tend to lean myself more towards individual sovereignty and self-determination to a sense, as opposed to collectivist kind of rule. I think for me there should be minimal government. Less government is good, but then the people that are governing us, Australians, need to be involved in what's being presented and who's actually representing you. And there's a few different, I guess, takes on the whole taxing system, because it's a fine balance, isn't it? Because there's been some conversations around, if you tax wealthy people too much and you don't get that balance right, they end up leaving. And some of these examples of around the world where you come after billionaires who actually do pay a lot of tax. When we've looked at some of this before, is that the lower portion of the population actually pays overall less tax than some of the billionaires and millionaires combined. So if you don't get that balance right, they end up leaving the country, or just finding ways to avoid paying it. And I guess this is the same with big business, big global corporatism, or big corporate businesses. They're the same. If things don't work well for them, they move. We see people like Elon Musk and others moved out of California, moved to Texas because it was more favorable to them. And so there's lots of different aspects. So I think it's about getting the playing field right, getting that balance right. But I'm also very conscious what you mentioned before about the resources taxes, finding that right balance between, because we know that people that extract resources from our country, there's a massive investment beforehand that goes into before you even get that money out and can make a profit on that. So it's really, with all these things, it's about finding that right balance. But I've always been of the mind, that the resources of a country, I believe a country is built by a set of values, and the borders are shaped by, values that people feel the same way, and that's how a nation's built. And the resources under the ground, I believe, do belong to the people of the nation. And I mean, Australia is a much more complex, because we're talking about the Aboriginal heritage part of it, and we're looking at sort of land rights and ownership of land and all that sort of stuff. So it is a bit more complex about who gets to divvy up the money that's dragged out of the resources that are dragged out of the ground. So, but I do agree we need to find a better balance to what's currently happening, because. And the other thing you mentioned about the cost of NDIS, and we've got this healthcare system and all that. One of the big costs, and I talk about this on some podcasts with my good mate Bruce Pay, who talks into this a lot, and a lot of people don't actually understand this. You ask the question and say, what do you think the biggest expense to someone in their lifetime is? What do you think would be the answer for most people? What would you think is the biggest expense to Australian people that you are aware of in their lifetime?
Accommodation?
It's actually government.
Oh.
Government is the most expensive thing, and in Australia, we've indicated. I just watched a YouTube video recently as well, where someone went through all the figures, and it was about 50% of whatever people are earning is actually tax. So if you 2.5 to 3 days of your working week is actually is actually done for the government, and the rest might be for you, and then you've got all your other expenses from there. So look, there's a massive issue I see, and that's again why I got involved with Australians for Better Government, and I guess that's why you're talking about Direct Democracy Australia. So it's about finding ways that we can do these things better, and I think part of that relies on more Australians being involved and seeing that there is alternatives out there to look at being involved to change the current system. And the website has a lot of interesting links in that as well. There's a lot of briefings. There's lots of briefings to Parliament. I noticed that you got your tabs there, just to run through this while kind of before we jump back into sort of a bit more talking about it. But you've got a tab there for people's vote choice. So it's really just a question there: should Australians have the right to vote directly on major national decisions? You're asking the population to say, oh, what's your thoughts on this? And this is one of the key things about direct democracy. It's about getting people involved to say, well, how do we want to be governed? From looking at your website. Then obviously you've got some learning options there and some resources. So you've got a supporter toolkit, you've got briefings for parliamentarians, an overview, the Swiss model implementation. So there's the website breaks it down quite extensively what Direct Democracy Australia is all about. But I guess the key thing is really just getting Australians involved, getting Australians to understand that there is groups like yours out there, like Democracy Australia, Direct Democracy Australia, to get the conversation going about it, because fundamentally a lot of people are realising there is something wrong in our country about the way we're governed. The last 5 years we've definitely explained that. So it's really encouraging people to come forward. Is that right?
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to make sure I mention is the fact that we're not allied with any political party. We're party neutral. We want people involved, and people who are wanting a better future and don't like the sort of the way things have been going. We want to give people the opportunity to be involved and to express their voice through voting And one of our, probably the area that we're leaning towards at the minute is to get involved with local government. That's just a choice to start there because it's sort of tangible, it's small enough that maybe we can get people to letterbox or knock on doors and invite people to show an interest in receiving information, having people attend council meetings and disseminating that information to the local people, to your neighbours and so on. Maybe to create opportunities to have polls on issues at the local level. And if there's a sufficient interest by the local people, then councils will most likely take notice and be willing to consult with them and conduct their own polls, so that people will have the opportunity to show that they are interested in important things that shape their community, shape their the level of rates which are charged to them, and take an interest in how those rates are spent, what priorities are determined at the council level. And around the world there have been councils that have involved people in spending portions of their budgets, determining whether there should be more schools or whether there should be more community services or recreation things. And that seems quite doable, that people could approach their local councillors to find out what are the priorities and to consult the local people about this. And that would be a great thing to start. So at some level, getting people to realise that we can come together, we don't have to agree on things, but we can be consulted, we can vote on things, we can see the results of that, we can impress upon councils that we want to be involved in those things. And this is potentially a start whereby people think, yes, why shouldn't we be consulted about these things? If a council is going to spend $40 million on some infrastructure, should we be consulted about that? That's going to have an impact on our rates. If they're going to take out a loan for such and such, is that something that we agree to? And so starting at one level, great, and then build upon that so that people get the idea that we should be involved in decisions at other levels as well.
And do you think that that sort of comes with, I guess, more people jumping on board with organisations like yours and organising, I guess, town hall meetings where they organise something and they explain about what the direct democracy Australia model is and how it could benefit them in that? Because I feel at the moment, even though there's more people really waking up and understanding that they need to play a bigger part in the way that they're governed, I still feel that there's a lot of Australians that are caught up in the whole breads and circuses and, distracted by lots of just everyday life stuff, that they're actually not hurting enough for them to want to really build that critical mass to affect changes within, say, local government, local council levels, or even at the state level before we even get to a national level. Do you feel that Australians that generally we're still a little way off that, or do you think the appetite and the mood is changing enough for enough people to get involved? Where do you think we're at the moment?
Yeah, I guess the next by-election in the eastern states will tell us something, and the state election in South Australia will tell us something. How many people will vote for a change, move away from the major parties. that will tell you whether they're happy enough with the major parties and they want more of the same, or whether they want something different. And so I can't predict the future. But more people are hurting. Will it be enough? We'll see.
Yeah, it is that critical mass stuff, isn't it? It's about, people, because we do know that, people they've lost a lot of faith in government. I know a lot of people, I've commented in my podcast about the amount of South Australians, even the last election, that were enrolled to vote and chose not to vote. There was about 120,000, so it's quite substantial, which is almost enough to get two quotas, two legislative council members elected. And then there's obviously about 40,000 people that just made a mess of their ballot, so yeah, we were talking 160,000 votes that kind of went astray. So a lot of people are losing interest as well in the electoral system because they feel their voices aren't heard. And I guess that's what the direct democracy is talking into a little bit about, getting involved to have them be heard. But a lot of people are moving away to the smaller communities. We see a rise of the My Places and people joining together to do, food sharing and, local, they're sharing lots of knowledge and assistance and support, homeschooling opportunities. So we're seeing a lot of, I'm seeing a lot of movement from people that were disenfranchised through COVID. And I think there's probably around 15% of Australians that are kind of in that path. So we're still sort of talking in our own echo chamber. So I see people making a move to kind of more community focused kind of support in that. It's really just trying to break through to the 80% of Australians and having them understand that the trajectory we're on is really not going to end well for us if we don't actually start to put some things in place. And I guess that's what you're trying to do with the work you're doing, myself with Australians for Better Government, and others with Australian lobby group that are pushing back on a lot of stuff that are happening, because there's a lot of lobbyists that have the ear of parliamentarians. So I do see personally that shift away from and doing their own thing in the community. But what we're looking at is getting that sort of 12 to 15% of people and have them work together to say, hey, look, here are some solutions which could benefit all of us. Because ultimately, the way I see it is, if we don't get the support of the 85 or 80% of Australians, we don't even need that many, but at least another 15 or 20%, we're going to be pushing massive boulder uphill because we're going to be working against the people that are kind of just going along with the government knows best. We're just going to continue living our life, and why would I get involved in politics? It's you've got this far left, far right, populist sort of stuff. So it's really about, I guess, having that conversation and getting the messaging right about the concerns that we have and the problems we see into the future, and then bringing more people along. What's your thoughts on that?
Yes, ultimately we need to bring more people along, and as people become more despondent about not having jobs, or or maybe having jobs but not good jobs, not enough to be able to save up for a house and think, and see a positive future, and have enough to raise a family. That's one of the things that might hit a lot of people. And hopefully we can give them options to become involved rather than they just become despondent and give up.
Yeah, absolutely. I noticed on the Direct Democracy Australia website, if people do want to obviously get involved, there's a contact us. As people can type in their details, and I suspect they'll get from there they'll get updates to any correspondence that goes out, any newsletters or anything else like that, or find ways that they can actually obviously get involved with Direct Democracy to kind of talk about and nut out some of the ideas that you guys are talking about. Obviously, check out the website. It's directdemocracyau.org is obviously the website, so people can jump on there to be involved as well. And I just wanted to, because you did bring them up, and I just wanted to quickly share. So you brought up Punters Politics. So this is Punter Politics YouTube channel that you were referencing earlier, and I'm hoping I've got this right. This is Gary's Economics as well, his YouTube channel that you were referencing as well, that talks into some of the stuff that you were talking about there. Yeah. So I guess the key thing is having people aware of what Direct Democracy Australia is all about. And I mean, the website, I had obviously a bit of a browse myself, and there is a lot of resources there. There's all these little drop downs here where people can read more about what it's all about, and it's a real good explainer. So I'll definitely encourage people to jump on there and check that out in its entirety as well. So what other key sort of message did you have, sort of, as we kind of look to wind up? Is there anything that in particular that you really wanted to sort of focus on more, you wanted people to know before sort of people to reach out and start to look at getting involved?
I think that I've covered all of the important things. I've talked about this really being a solution, or a potential solution, but it needs people to become involved. I've talked about the direction that the economy is going, and how it's becoming more and more difficult, and that we can't take for granted that we will have the level of prosperity that we've had in past decades. And that's what we're seeing throughout the world. There's sort of unrest and sort of movement away from certain parties. People looking to new parties to make a difference. However, without people becoming involved directly, it stands the risk of just another party being faced with the challenges of finding enough money through taxation to spend on the services that people require. And governments don't want to make hard decisions. They want to get voted back in. And so, there's a tendency to promise things. But, eventually they'll run out of our money to spend. And we need to be involved directly so that we're part of the decision-making process when there are tough decisions to be made.
Yeah, they're very good at spending other people's money. That's for sure. And when you're printing money, and you're spending more money than what you're actually bringing in, and inflation goes through the roof. And we hear now that real wages aren't keeping up with inflation, which makes it even harder. So at every turn, Australians are finding it very hard to make ends meet. And a lot of commentators are obviously indicating that it is because of the fault of government that we're in the predicament we're in. And unfortunately, it's also about effective leadership and I guess knowledge and just know-how as ministers as well, and bureaucrats. Because the thing is, you brought up the NDIS earlier. I mean, as a concept, it's great because we want to be able to look after our most vulnerable. Obviously, that's part of our values and inherent traits, that we really want to care for those of us that aren't in a position to do so themselves. But unfortunately, what happens, it's the management of those initiatives. What ends up happening is that when you have government money involved, or other people's money, like taxpayer money involved, organisations inflate prices, and you have a lot of rorting, and you have a lot of fraud, and so all these things come about. So it's all good and well having these systems in place, but if they're not audited and managed effectively, then they end up blowing out like they are now, and the NDIS is costing the nation a bucket load of money. And like you rightly say, if we were getting more from our resources, we should it would cover that. But I think it goes deeper than that. We really any organisation, if you're using taxpayer money, it shouldn't just be, oh well, it's a freebie, it's other people's money, so let's just spend it nilly-willy. There has to be just as much accountability of spending taxpayer money as it would as a CEO for a private organisation that's accountable for, making sure that money isn't spent nilly-willy and without regard. And I don't think there's enough of that accountability within government and bureaucracy, and I think so that's a fundamental thing that needs changing as well.
Yeah. In Switzerland, for instance, they, at the federal level, they've had votes on things about whether to increase I think they have a 13, so you get paid every month if you're on the pension, and there was some decision to be made about whether they make a 13-month payment every year. They've made decisions about whether to join the EU or not. They've made decisions about whether to maintain their army or not. With respect to migrants coming into the country, and whether they can be, when do they stay there long enough that they can also be given the vote on these matters. And it has been the case that they need to stay in one of, instead of our 6 states or whatever, they have 26 cantons. And so, as I understand it, people that come into the country, they need to reside in one of the cantons for 10 years before they are given the right to vote like other citizens. So their cantons are smaller, perhaps 300,000 people in the canton on average. And so if they stay in a place for 10 years, people get to know them. They really get to know them. And so there was a vote on whether they should reduce that down to 5 years. And the people voted to keep it at 10 years. So very fundamental and important matters go to the people for a vote. And another sort of slightly quirky thing, or a consequence of the fact that the people are involved and there's so much scrutiny over what the parliamentarians do. One of the politicians was being interviewed, and he was saying most of the politicians are part-time. He said, we don't want to meddle in people's lives that much. We don't need to meddle in people's lives that much, that we need to be full-time as politicians. And so most of them are part-time. They're working as teachers or a bartender or a truck driver. They're doing other things. So they're really closely involved in the population. They know what's going on. They hear people's complaints. He said you also might find the leader of the country catching a train to work. Unlike us, got a security detail around them, chauffeur-driven, etc. In Switzerland, they're not buggering up the country. People don't hate them. They're not in charge of the final decisions, really. The people are in charge of it. And so it sounds like it's safe enough to travel to work by train. And it's just interesting that system is worlds apart from what we live in. It's just worth sharing those.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, and some of those things are definitely, resonate with me. I'd love now, with my knowledge now and being more sort of politically motivated and politically minded, is the idea that that the people get together and vote for some of those things. Migration's obviously a hot topic in Australia. So if the population had an opportunity to vote on the cap or how many, or for how long should we pause it, or again, like you mentioned, maybe how long someone needs to reside in the country before they have an effective opportunity to vote. I mean, these are all really powerful suggestions, and if it's working over in Switzerland, then it's definitely something worthwhile considering for some of these things. Even if you look at a state level and look at it from here. I mean, you know, we've just seen the Labor and Liberal Party pass legislation here in South Australia, in our state, on stronger emergency powers here, so to be enacted. So I mean, this is something that should go back to the people and say, well, you know, do you want that level of power in the government's hands in case of emergency, or do you feel it should be pulled back? So some, you know, things like that, some, you know, big things, and especially constitutional changes, which we do. We have the referendum, but I mean, I think there should be many more things, citizen-initiated referendums that we should have a say in, rather than saying, oh, here we go, there's 4 years, there's an open slather, do what you can, and a lot of the times they actually do the worst they can. And without any recourse, you know, if you have a minister that's totally inept at their role or whatever, there's no, you know, I mean, recall elections is another one, you know, being able to say, well, you've performed so badly that we need to be looking at, you know, getting you out of there and getting someone else in there, you know, those sorts of things, I think, is really something that Australians really need to start to consider really heavily. So I do like the idea of the model that you guys are talking about there.
Well, I think I've come to the end of the information I wanted to share, and so thank you very much for this opportunity to share these ideas. And we'd love to hear people make contact through the website.
Yeah, 100%. So, you know, if just for a reminder of people, or just to remind you again, that's it's directdemocracyau.org, and that's the website, and you can check out all the resources there, and obviously reach out via the contact. And I'm sure you've got people there on hand that should be able to respond to people's questions and requests. And obviously, one of the key things, I guess, Tom, is looking for people to get involved, to continue the conversation, to see how the conversation can grow, and how the model can grow here in Australia at either a local council level, state level, or even a federal level. So I think we need to be looking at all things. As I mentioned before, there's lots of groups, there's lots of initiatives, a lot of pushback against the traditional legacy political parties and the way that we are being governed, and the last 5 years have done that. So I think the initiative of groups like yours, and even the ones that I'm involved in, it's important for us to co-collaborate and talk and bring people together to try and find the right balance for Australians. But the key thing is that they have a choice about, you know, and an understanding of how they are governed, and they should definitely have a voice and a choice in how they're governed more effectively. And that's kind of what I'm sort of for as well. And good to see that you and the Direct Democracy team are doing that as well.
Great.
Yeah,
well, thanks
good on you, Tom.
Chat.
No worries at all. Well, I'm wishing you all the very best, and we'll obviously stay in touch and look at ways that we can continue to contribute and help each other raise awareness. So all the best. Good on you, Tom.
Thanks.
Good evening. Could I have your attention for the next 3 minutes? I'd like you to see and hear something which we feel is rather special.
God-given land of ours, Australia, this proud possession, our own piece of earth, that was built by our fathers who pioneered our heritage. Here in Australia, the land of our birth. Our land, Australia. should danger ever threaten us, let the world know we will answer.